We have been looking at the various rules of Bible interpretation, and mainly it's read the entire Bible, read the individual book under consideration, and we looked at those 6 things as to questions to ask as we read the individual book. Make an outline of the book, then read the section that you're going to be studying in, read the chapter, then read the verse or verses, considering the context, making sure that your conclusions do not contradict other plain passages of Scripture. Consider the grammar, and we noted specifically from the Greek grammar, more so than the English. Excuse me. Even though the English is probably better for us, yet in any interpretation which contradicts Greek grammar cannot be a correct interpretation. So it always goes back to the original as to what they wrote. Then we've been looking at, is it figurative language? And in that, I think everybody has one of those. We're down to J in that, irony. Irony is not like ironing. The younger people would say, what's that? But irony is a word meaning dissembling, or to dissemble in speech. It's to say one thing while meaning another thing. Normally it's meaning the opposite of what you're saying. And of course, with all of these figures of speech, examples help us probably more in understanding them than definition per se. 1 Kings 18 and verse 27. Now, if you remember the context of this, Elijah has challenged these false prophets. And so they are now having this contest, and they are trying to get their gods to answer in the sacrifice that they're offering. And so Elijah begins making fun of them, in effect. Verse 27 says, "And it came to pass at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, 'Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is talking, or he is pursuing, or he is in a journey, or peradventure he sleepeth and must be awakened.'" He's using irony here in mocking them. And so yes, that irony is in this case a form of mocking. Yes? Don't you have the sheet? That handout? Figures of speech? Yeah, irony is J in that. Skip over a few verses, but irony is spelled I-R-O-N-Y. To 1 Kings 22. And this is King Ahab. And he's trying to convince another king to go to battle with him. And he has all of these prophets who are saying, yes, go to battle, go and you're going to win the war. And the king said, isn't there one more? Well, yeah, there is one more prophet, but he hates me. Well, let's read it. Well, go ahead. And so he calls Micaiah in verses 15 through 18 of 1 Kings 22. Says, so he came to the king. That's Micaiah. And the king said unto him, Micaiah, shall we go against Ramoth Gilead to battle, or shall we forbear? And he answered him, go and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hand of the king. And the king said unto him, how many times shall I adjure thee that thou tell me nothing but that which is true in the name of the Lord? And he, Micaiah, said, I saw all Israel scattered upon the hills as sheep that have not a shepherd. And the Lord said, these have no master. Let them return, every man to his house, in peace. And the king of Israel said unto Jehoshaphat, that's the other king, he's trying to get to go to battle with him, did I not tell thee that he would prophesy no good concerning me, but evil? Now then, what did he initially say, though? Go and prosper, for the Lord shall deliver it into the hand of the king. Now, what would cause Ahab then to respond in verse 16 to say to him, how many times shall I adjure thee that thou tell me nothing but that which is true in the name of the Lord? Why would he answer like that? Because he said it in such a way, in such a fashion, not the actual words, but the manner in which he said it, so that the king knew that he was not meaning what he said. Have you ever seen someone respond to a person that is asking a question or wanting to do something, and they come to you and ask, and yeah, you go ahead and do it, or something along that line, and you don't mean it? That's not what you're saying. That's what's happening here. He is saying it in such a manner or such a way that Ahab knew that's not what he means. So tell us the truth. Okay, you're going to die. And Israel's going to be scattered. That's what's going to happen. And then he turns, see, I told you he would prophesy evil against me. But that's irony in which that which Micaiah stated, or the manner in which he stated it on this occasion. In the New Testament, we just give a couple, where in Acts the 2nd chapter and verse 13, if you remember verses 1 through 4, the Holy Spirit comes to the apostles. There's a great gathering of people, verses 5 through verse 12, or actually verse 13. And some people are wondering, what's going on here? And verse 13 says that others, mocking, said, these men are full of new wine. The idea of mocking there is the use of irony. These men are drunk, is what they're saying. In 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 19, he says, for ye suffer fools gladly, saying ye yourselves are wise. That's Paul using irony in relationship to the Corinthian brethren. You allow these fools, because you're so wise. Actually, they had gone after those fools. This is a sad part. But they rejoiced in suffering, or in allowing those fools, suffering fools, gladly. It's the use of irony to say one thing when generally it's meaning something else, the opposite. Sarcasm, the next one, is closely associated with irony. It's a form of it. But sarcasm is more severe. It's harsher in degree and in intensity. It comes from a word which means to tear flesh, like dogs. Thus a rending, a tearing, or a wounding with cutting words, to speak bitterly, to sneer. Just the definition of the word sarcasm, cutting words, or wounding with cutting words. Speak bitterly, sneer. Tells you a lot about what sarcasm is all about. Sarcasm is only used for reproof or condemnation. To a great extent, you would see a lot of that even in Matthew, the 23rd chapter with Jesus. And I'm not going to spend time reading the entire chapter, but you can, and you'll see the numerous times, woe to these scribes, Pharisees, hypocrites. And I think he uses that phrase 7 times in the chapter. Might be off on the number. Matthew 23. The whole chapter. But if you listen to the words of Jesus there's a lot of sarcasm that's there. In Matthew, the 27th chapter. Oh, and by the way, Jesus' use of it shows us that it's not wrong to use sarcasm at times. It can be an effective tool in trying to get a point across. That's right. Matthew 27 and verse 29. And it says, when they had platted a crown of thorns, they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand, and they bowed the knee before him and mocked him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews. Think that's sarcasm? When they say, Hail, King of the Jews to Jesus? They didn't mean it in the least. It was sarcasm, cutting, biting words, sneering at him. In Matthew, or in Acts, the 23rd chapter, if you recall, Paul has been arrested as the high priest, or not the high priest, the chief captain Lysias is taking him up to the castle. He asks to speak to him and ask if he can speak to the people, and he does. He allows it. There's a great commotion because of what he says. He used the word Gentiles. That's really what it was. That God had sent him to the Gentiles, and at that word, a riot takes place. So Lysias takes him up. He has him bound, and he's going to torture him. Cat of nine tails basically used against him. And Paul asked, is it lawful for you to bind a Roman citizen? And they got scared to death. Not only was it not lawful to scourge a Roman citizen. It was not lawful to even bind a Roman citizen to be scourged. A person who did that, or an officer who did that, could lose his life. They could have all been killed for binding a Roman citizen. That's why they were scared. So in order to find out what's all the commotion about, Lysias decides, I'll have the Sanhedrin get together and we'll take Paul down and we'll find out what's going on. As Paul gets there, the high priest has him struck, smitten across the face. And in verse 3 of Acts 23, it says, Then Paul said unto him, God shall smite thee, thou whited wall, for sittest thou to judge me after the law, and commandest me to be smitten contrary to the law? I think there's a lot of anger, a lot of sarcasm in God shall smite thee, thou whited wall. Now then, he didn't know that individual was the high priest. And when he finds out, he says, well, you're not supposed to speak evil of the high priest. And that's when he said, for the hope of the resurrection, or I'm a Pharisee, and for the hope of the resurrection, I'm standing here. And that caused a riot among the Sanhedrin. Paul kind of used the law in those cases to avail himself of his desired outcome. Because of his position, but yeah, what he said was true. But he still had, right. When he found out that he was the high priest, I shouldn't have said that, even though it's true. Basically, I think he's saying, I should not have said it in the way that I did. I should have shown more respect to the high priest because of the office which he holds. But then he defended it by saying, basically, it's true. The next one, hyperbole. Hyperbole literally means to throw or to cast above or over or beyond. Thus, it's excess, talking about excess of something. It's exaggerating something for the purpose of emphasis. We do it all the time. Paul, have you ever heard someone come to you and say, everyone in the congregation is, and then when you start asking who, it's that individual, of course, but they are using hyperbole. Everyone is, well, not everyone, it's just you. In reality, maybe your family, maybe one or two others, but it's hyperbole. Turn over 1 Samuel chapter 25 and verse 37. It came to pass in the morning when the wine was gone out of Nabal. Now who was Nabal? Well, this is when David was trying to escape, and he and his soldiers come by and ask Nabal for food and drink, and Nabal refuses. I think he was a fool. 25:37. But now then in the morning, when the wine was gone out of Nabal, and his wife had told him these things, the things that she told him is that she took food and drinks to his soldiers, even though Nabal had refused. Now notice what it says, his heart died within him, and he became as a stone. Got a little bit of hyperbole there? Did his heart literally die within him? No. He became as a stone, literally? No. It's use of hyperbole to express the, not just simply disappointment, but we might say he was crushed. He was crushed by what she had done, and now then what she's telling him.
That's hyperbole.
So that would be hyperbole in those cases. In Matthew 11 and verse 23, it talks about, and now Capernaum, which are exalted unto heaven, shall be brought down to hell. For if the mighty works which had been done in thee had been done in Sodom, it would have remained until this day. Was Capernaum literally exalted unto heaven, or was that a little bit of a hyperbole there? Hyperbole. Exaggeration. Had they been exalted? Yes. To heaven? Well, now you're starting into the hyperbole. Same idea with brought down to hell. Well, again, hyperbole. Turn over to Psalm 51. If you remember, the 51st Psalm is a psalm of David after Nathan had come to him. This is after David had committed sin with Bathsheba and then had her husband killed in battle. Uriah the Hittite murdered him. Nathan then comes to David, tells him this little parable, and David is outraged at it, said basically, the man's going to die. Who is it? Tell me who it is. He's going to be put to death. And Nathan's response, you're the one. This is you. And it made him realize his sin. Now then Psalm 51 is written in light of that. And the whole psalm. And he's pleading, of course, in the first few verses for mercy, the mercy of God to cleanse him. And then in verse 4, I've sinned against you, God, and done this evil. All sin is ultimately against God, and he's acknowledging that. But then we come to verse 5. Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. That has become probably the major passage to try to prove, and that's with quotes around it, prove total depravity. And those Calvinists who believe in total depravity would, every time they'll go to this passage. I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Thus David was conceived in sin, was born as a sinner, wicked sinner. We're not going to go on with the chapter, but does this prove that we're born in sin? Absolutely not. What is David doing here? Isn't he, going back into the background of it, isn't he saying, I have committed sin? And asking God to forgive him. That's the context of it. It's not how he was born, that he was born a sinner. It's that he committed sin. And basically, that's what sin is, something that we do. It's an action or a thought that we have. That's what sin is. It's not something we're born with. But they go to this passage. Brethren, through the years, have come up with several different explanations. And some are, I'm not sure that they have been given by our brethren necessarily, but some explanations have been rather far-fetched in my eyes. One is, in fact, there's several views of that it's David's mother being in sin. And thus he was conceived in sin, that she's the one who committed the sin. And some of them advocate, just to give you various views on the mother being in sin, that she had committed fornication, and from that fornication David had been born. What evidence is there for that? Well, let's see. Karen asked me if I had authority for, having this up here, and I told her, yeah, Hatcher 4:2. Well, that's about the same authority that they find for that view. There's no evidence for it whatsoever. Some have said that from this that the sexual act itself is sinful then. And thus, the produce of that, being David in this case, his mother committed sin while having sexual relations with his father. Contradicts rather what Jesus says in Genesis 1:28, to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Also in Hebrews 13 and verse 4, that marriage is honorable in the old and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers or fornicators and whoremongers God will judge. How could it be holy and undefiled if it's sinful? Here's one that about David's mother, supposedly, that it's not actually David's mother that he's talking about. Instead, it is Mother Israel. Have you ever heard anyone today talking about Mother Earth? Well, this is Mother Israel. Hush, we'll get to that. Well, again, there's no evidence he's talking about that here. A fourth one is that it's not actual sin that he's talking about, but that it's uncleanness, ritual uncleanness. There were things that would make a person unclean that were not actually sinful. For example, the touching of a dead body, you would be unclean for a certain length of time. It wasn't sinful, but you were unclean. And so he's talking about ritual uncleanness here. Again, nothing in the psalm about that. How do we understand it? What are we studying about? Hyperbole. The use of exaggeration. Remember, this is poetry, and there is a poetic license, if you will, in which things are, yes, many times exaggerated. What is he saying? Well, go back to verse 4. Against thee only have I done what? Sinned. Is he talking about his mother's sin? Or someone else's sin? Or is he talking about what he has done? What he's done. Now then, to show the extreme aspect of this, he says, in effect, I've been a sinner since birth. Just to use that phraseology. Not literally, but using exaggeration, hyperbole. What is it in, I think it's the 58th chapter or Psalm? He talks about a baby who speaks lies from the time that they were born. Does a baby lie when he's born? From the time that he's born? He's using exaggeration, hyperbole. To exaggerate something, to show in this case, the enormity of his sin. Look at this horrible thing that I did. And so he uses hyperbole to express the greatness of his sin. Expressing the idea in exaggerated form that I have been a sinner since I was born. And again, it's David being the sinner. I, not his mother, or anything like that, but it's showing the enormity of his sin. So hyperbole is oftentimes used. Some have claimed the environment, that he was born into an environment of sin and still in an environment. The problem I have with that is that what does that have to do with what this psalm is about? That he himself committed sin. In a sinful environment. And I know brethren who have held that position. I just don't see it because he's talking about his own, what he himself has done. And it wasn't the environment that caused him to do it. It was his actions. And he's confessing his sin, not the sin of the environment that I'm in. So, look
how many people blame their parents for their life, for their mistakes.
Well, yeah, a lot of people blame parents, heredity, environment, whatever, for what they've done. And I don't see David doing that here. by the way, a lot of these answers that we've given through the years, as long as they do not contradict, remember that, read the verses, and then conflicts be there, it's on the screen. As long as it does not conflict with plain passages of scriptures and the entirety of the Bible's teaching, what difference does it make? I may think that it's wrong and that there's no basis for that understanding, but if it does not conflict with other plain passages of scripture, well, if you want to hold that, that's fine.
There's just so that, like Paul's writing, as far as we understood, you don't read.
Just don't wrest it from the context of the Bible. And the Bible clearly teaches that man is born without sin, and that sin is an action which the individual takes, not something that he has inherited. So that goes back to, again, all of this that we're studying, if it conflicts with other plain passages, which the Calvinistic view contradicts other plain passages of Scripture, and we can prove that. So it cannot be right. And when you have something that contradicts other plain passages, you've got to throw something out. And in this case, you throw out the Calvinistic doctrine of total depravity. Now, can you keep others? Sure, as long as it doesn't conflict with other passages. Next, a simile. Webster defines it as a figure of speech comparing two unlike things that is often introduced by like or as. Gene Taylor, in his book on hermeneutics, said a thing or action that is said to be like or as something of a different kind or quality. In the very first Psalm, verse 3 and verse 4, we have some of these similes. And he shall be like, there's that word, like a tree planted by rivers of water that bringeth forth his fruit in his seasons. His leaf also shall not wither, and whatsoever he doeth shall prosper. The ungodly are not so, but are like, there's that word again, are like the chaff which the wind driveth away. So righteous like a tree, ungodly like chaff. There's similes because the use of the word like. In Matthew 9 and verse 36, this is when Jesus saw the multitudes. He was moved with compassion on them because they fainted and were scattered abroad as sheep having no shepherd. Scattered as, there's that key word again, like or as sheep having no shepherd. So again, a simile being used by Jesus. 1 Peter 1 and verse 24. For all flesh is as, there's that word, as, grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away. So all flesh is as, makes it a simile, grass. A metaphor, Webster defines it as a word or phrase literally denoting one kind of object or idea is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or an analogy between them. It is calling one thing by another word that is more descriptive and is figurative. A simile uses the words like or as, while a metaphor does not. That's the difference between them in reality. In Luke 13 and verse 32, Jesus said unto them, Go ye and tell that fox. He's talking about Herod here. Go ye and tell that fox, Behold, I cast out devils and do cures today and tomorrow, and the third day I shall be perfected. Jesus states that Herod is a fox, not like a fox or as a fox, which would be a similar. Here he uses a metaphor. Herod is a fox. We read 1 Peter 1:24 that all flesh is as grass. The use of as, making it a simile. This is a quotation from Isaiah 40 and verse 6. The voice said, cry, and he said, what shall I cry? All flesh is grass, and all the goodness thereof is as the flower of the field. All flesh is grass. Here he uses a metaphor, while Peter, in quoting it, uses simile for it, because he uses like grass, or as grass. In Matthew 26, verse 26, and as they were eating, Jesus took bread and blessed it and brake it and gave it to the disciples and said, take, eat. This is my body. Now, this was unleavened bread. And he said, this is my body. Was the unleavened bread literally the body of Jesus? No. He's using a metaphor to express the idea of it representing his body. Now then, I'll just kind of introduce it, but I'm not going to go into it because we don't have time. There's two types of metaphors that are used in relationship to God. And we'll talk about those next week. Are there any questions on that we've discussed tonight? Good. Either it was so confusing you don't even can't even ask a question about it, or else it was so clear that you understand it all.